and then we'll hand it over. Thank you. This meeting is being recorded so that we can put this up on our YouTube page for those who aren't able to join us today. I'm going to kick us off with a brief introduction, and then we'll throw it over to our panelists who will be sharing their expert insights that relate to minimum lot sizes. So first off, if you haven't joined us before, we are Desegregate Connecticut. We are a pro-homes coalition of neighbors and nonprofits, and we believe that better zoning laws can lead to a more equitable and sustainable Connecticut. This slide shows some of the almost 80 coalition partners we have from throughout the state, made up of professional organizations, environmental groups, racial justice groups, economic development groups, and others who all recognize that zoning reform is needed in order for us to achieve what we want to achieve as a state and to provide a home for everyone in Connecticut. So first off, just to tee off this conversation, I want to introduce what minimum lot sizes are. And in brief, it's the amount of land required per home. And we know that the larger that we require lots to be, the fewer homes that we can build. In Connecticut, we've collected a lot of data in our zoning atlas, which includes data on minimum lot sizes in Connecticut. And we know that in our state, 81% of residential land has a minimum lot size of 0.92 acres or more. If that number seems very specific, that's because we did this originally by square footage. So 0.92 acres equals 20,000 square feet. And the vast majority of our land requires almost an acre or more to build a home on, which is quite high. And even more extreme is that almost half of our land requires a minimum lot size of 1.84 acres or 40,000 square feet or more, as shown in the purple on this map. We know that over 50% of the land in 68 towns requires 1.84 acres or more to build a home on. And you see the list of those towns here. And just as one example of the effects that those regulations have, we know that those 68 towns with large lot requirements or 1.84 acres or more, covering 50% of their land or more, have much higher carbon emissions, for example. In particular, they have much higher transportation-related emissions because large lot requirements spread people out, putting people in their cars for longer, meaning they have much higher average minimum vehicle miles traveled in order to get where they need to go. And they also have higher housing-related carbon emissions because larger lots produce larger homes, which take up a lot more energy to electrify and a lot more oil to heat. So that's just one of the reasons that we know that minimum lot size reform is necessary. That highlights the environmental reason. There's also a huge equity reason to do so, to promote affordability, and an economic reason to do so, to provide for more diverse housing needs and to stimulate growth and development in Connecticut. So our proposal for minimum lot sizes, just to tee up this conversation with our panel of experts, is to reduce lot size mandates to 1/8 of an acre anywhere there is a connection to water and sewer infrastructure. This proposal does include some carve-outs for roads and railways, waterways, and some other sensitive lands. And it's similar, although somewhat more ambitious, to bipartisan legislation that was recently passed in Vermont. If you're interested in learning more about our legislative agenda as it relates to minimum lot sizes, or in addition, our legislative agenda concerning transit-oriented communities and simplifying zoning processes and expanding town options, you can go to the platform page on our website, which I will be sure to drop in the chat. But without further ado, I'm eager to hand it over to our expert panel. First off, we have Amrita Kolka, who's joining us. We have Nolan Gray from UCLA. And finally, we have Corinne Moody. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Amrita, who's the first of our presenters today.
Thanks a lot. Wait, let me just share. Let me figure out how to share. my slides. Okay, I hope everyone can both see me and see my slides. Perfect. All right, so thanks a lot for inviting me. Thanks to Nick, to Sarah, to Catherine for organizing this, and to for bringing together this sort of virtual room full of people that are interested in what I think is a really important question. This question of how minimum lot sizes affect who lives where, affect what neighborhoods look like, and can contribute to inequality in a spatial sense as well. So I'm happy to be here today to talk a little bit about what I've found out through some research that I've done on these types of regulations. And I wanted to kick it off, not that I think this is probably not a room where it's important to motivate why we care about minimum lot sizes or land use regulation, but just by showing a quote from a Brookings report in 2012 here, which says that in the most strictly regulated jurisdictions, and this is regulated in terms of land use regulations, public elementary schools are ranked 16 percentage points higher on standardized state test scores than the metropolitan average, and annual costs of renting a home or paying a mortgage are almost $4,000 higher. And I think this is a really good example of why I think we can't ignore land use regulations, or why we can't ignore minimum lot sizes in particular, because it seems to be that these regulations might be systematically leading to different households, perhaps of different incomes, to living in different areas. And also, it might affect who has access to which kind of opportunities. So you can think of elementary schools here as one, but you could have this as a stand-in for other kinds of opportunities as well. And so the questions that I ask mostly tend to be related to this motivation. And in particular, I focus on minimum lot sizes because this is one of the most common land use regulations in the US. And I ask questions that are somewhat along the lines of, so to what extent do minimum lot sizes affect sort of who lives where? How do they affect house characteristics? So how are they affecting who lives where? They do it by affecting the characteristics of homes, as also was said in the introduction, and how do they affect affordability and supply of housing as well? So I want to talk about two papers. So whatever I know about minimum lot sizes, I found out by working on two papers. And I just wanted to put a disclaimer that these aren't published yet, so they're in the publication process, but just to state that they're not published as of now. But I'll be talking about two papers. So the first one is going to be thinking about the context of Wake County in North Carolina, and the second one actually looks at the greater Boston area. And what's interesting is that even though these two papers are from two completely different contexts, and looking at land use regulations or minimum lot sizes in different contexts, they do give us similar results, or results that are in line with each other. So this is, I think, quite striking, and I'm sure we'll hear more later on as well on other contexts in which we find similar results. So the first paper focuses on Wake County, and it's looking mostly at the single family home context. And the big question that I ask here is sort of, how do minimum lot sizes affect the composition of neighborhoods? And I want to summarize my findings in sort of one sentence here, but to do that, I want you to imagine sort of a normal road in a neighborhood, and one side of this road allows a minimum lot size, or mandates a minimum lot size of 1/4 of an acre, and the other side of the road has a minimum lot size of 1/3 of an acre. So what I find is that the houses, or the income of the households living on the side of the road that has 1/3 of an acre minimum lot size have 4.5% higher household income. So you're decreasing the allowed density by 1 dwelling unit per acre, and that means that households that are wealthier by 4.5% are going to be living in that side of the road. So this is quite striking, considering that this is just sort of an arbitrary road in a neighborhood, right? So I think that this shows that minimum lot sizes tremendously affect sort of who can live where. And the second question that I try to answer in this paper is thinking about who might benefit if you relax the minimum lot size regulation. And what I find is that if you think about relaxing minimum lot sizes from 1/2 an acre to 1/10 of an acre in one neighborhood, this is going to reduce the average household income by 30%. Now, I want to state that what I find in my research applies mostly to sort of these smaller changes in land use regulation. So I'm not going to be able to say very much about how would things change if the entire city changed its land use or its minimum lot size, but I can say something about these small changes. And we find these drops in average household income because households with incomes that are lower than the average household income before tend to move into these neighborhoods. The second paper looks at a different context. So this is going to be focusing on the greater Boston area. And we consider not just single family homes, but all types of housing, so also apartment buildings. And we think about mostly how different kinds of zoning regulations interact to affect housing supply and affordability for owners and renters. Now, I'm not going to talk much about it, but the part that I do want to mention here, which is important for our discussion today, I think, is that you can't really get around density regulations, of which minimum lot sizes are a huge part if you want to affect supply or decrease housing prices and rents. So we find that compared to other regulations, such as height regulations, or allowing, for example, multifamily homes to be built in the first place, density regulations really play a key role. So this is not standalone. These papers contribute to sort of the economics literature, and I don't want to spend much time here just to say that what this literature has found that land use regulations, while they might be able to be used to efficiently provide some public goods like local education, this comes at a high cost, which is large welfare transfers. So typically increasing housing prices and also slowing economic growth across regions. And the remaining time that I have, I just want to talk about a couple of facts and show you some pictures which I think drive home the points that I already made a little bit more. So when I started researching this, I thought that maybe these regulations exist, but they don't really matter. So maybe households or maybe the actual lots aren't really following these regulations anyway. But one way to immediately see that minimum lot sizes matter is to look at the realized lot size and compare it to the minimum lot size. So that's what I'm going to do here. And you can think about if the realized lot sizes are exactly at the minimum, then you can imagine, well, if the minimum were smaller, then lots might also end up being smaller. So there's a demand for smaller lots, in other words. So this is a map of Wake County. So the inner part here is Raleigh, the main city in Wake County. And what I'm plotting here is the allowed density. So the darker the color is, the higher the allowed density, and so the smaller the minimum lot sizes. What you can see is obviously that in downtown Raleigh and in the city, we have higher density and smaller minimum lot sizes, but you can also see that in the suburbs, the minimum lot sizes are quite large, and maximum allowed density is low. And I can also tell you that down here are a lot of neighborhoods or towns that families really want to move to, for example, to take advantage of public schools. Now, if you remember that here we have sort of the lighter colors on the outside and the darker colors on the inside, now you can see this is kind of flipped in this picture. And why is that? What I'm plotting here is the fraction of lots in an area that are exactly at the minimum lot size. So building at the smallest allowable lot size, basically. And what you can see is this is inversed. So in places that have really tight regulations, we find a really large fraction of homes exactly at the minimum lot size. So in other words, building as small as they possibly can. Again, more evidence that relaxing minimum lot sizes might actually lead to smaller lots, which are in demand here. So the second point I want to make is that minimum lot sizes affect characteristics of homes and that they segregate families along income lines. And so to do that, I'll show you some pictures from the paper. Don't worry too much about the details here, but imagine that this line here in the middle is sort of, again, that boundary, so that road between two sides that are regulated differently. And so everything that's going to be on the right here is sort of the side of the road that has the higher minimum lot size, so is more strictly regulated, and everything that's on the left is less strictly regulated, has a lower minimum lot size. Now, and what I'm showing you here is a change in the deeded acres per lot. So if minimum lot sizes didn't matter, we might not really expect to see any difference here. But what we find is that on the more regulated side of these boundaries, there's a 45% increase in the deeded acreage of lots. So larger minimum lot sizes lead to larger lots and more expensive homes. So we find that the total sales price here is up by almost 9% on the side of the road that has sort of the stricter minimum lot size, the larger lots. And that leads to households that live there being wealthier or are having higher incomes by about 16%. So this is systematically leading to households of different incomes living on different sides of the street. And again, there's not much reason for there to be a difference here, except that there's a change in the regulation at these boundaries. All right, so the last point I want to make is that relaxing minimum lot sizes has strong effects, especially in suburbs. And to do that, we'll switch gears a little bit, and this is evidence from the greater Boston area now. So these are towns in the greater Boston area. This is Boston. And what we're showing here is how allowing one additional unit on a dwelling, one additional dwelling unit on an acre of land changes the supply of either 2 to 3 unit homes or 4+ unit homes. And everything that's red here is an increase, and everything that's blue is going to be a decrease here. So I don't want to spend so much time on the amounts here, but basically what we see is that allowing an additional dwelling unit on an acre of land really increases the supply of 2 to 3 unit homes in these suburban towns around Boston. And it increases the supply of sort of higher density 4+ unit homes in Boston and its surrounding towns. What does it do to prices? Well, it lowers rents in Boston and its surrounding towns. But what's interesting here, I'll be done in a second, is what it's doing to house prices is that the further out you go, so you have these really strong falls in house prices in sort of suburban towns that are further away from Boston. So that shows us that the potential for relaxing prices by lowering minimum lot size is going to be highest in these suburbs. The last point, which I'll just mention but not talk about in detail, is that especially households with below median incomes could benefit from relaxing minimum lot sizes. But I think I don't have time to go over that. So that's sort of where I'll leave it. And I'm looking forward to your discussions, to your questions in the discussion in a little bit. So I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much for sharing that really powerful research that drives home so much of, I think, what our group has intuitively been interested in, but really makes a really strong empirical case. So thank you for sharing. Next up, we have Nolan Gray, who is currently a PhD student at the University of California at Los Angeles. Nolan, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much. Let me share my screen. So, hi everyone. My name is Nolan Gray. As Nick said, I'm working on a PhD out here at UCLA. I was a professional city planner in New York. First of all, thanks so much for organizing this. I was just joking before the panel started. When I was in the Mid-Atlantic, there was no conversation about state level preemption on some of these land use issues. And then, of course, the year I moved to California, desegregate Connecticut starts the conversation over there. But so it's been fun to watch from afar. I'm going to cover some of the same territory and focus maybe more on reform of lot sizes. But so just back to basics, right? So minimum lot sizes, as Nick started us off, a minimum lot size says that you cannot plat a lot that is below a certain number of square feet, or in a rural context, acres. These can vary quite a lot, right? So in a more standard Sunbelt or Mountain West subdivision, this might be 5,000 square feet. In a Mid-Atlantic or a New England context, this can be anywhere from a half an acre all the way up to 2 acre minimums. Really varies a lot by the municipality. And there are certain reasons why you might want to have lot sizes, right? So in contexts where you don't have wet infrastructure, you don't have sewer or water infrastructure already built in, you do need some distance between homes that are using septic and well water to avoid contamination, to avoid environmental risks, depending on the soil quality, depending on the depth of the water table. But in most urban contexts where you have sewer or water infrastructure already built in, there's not actually a real health and safety justification for minimum lot sizes. They principally serve to increase the cost of housing and to impose a particular aesthetic vision or cultural vision, as this old graphic from the 50s so helpfully shows. So kind of covering some of the same territory as Amrita in a different context here. Why should we care about minimum lot sizes, right? If minimum lot sizes were only applying in context where you didn't have water or sewer, or if they didn't seem to really actually increase minimum lots, if they didn't seem to increase lot sizes, we probably wouldn't really care about them, right? But as Amrita noted in the North Carolina context and some of the work that I've done with my colleague Salim Firth in exurban Texas, minimum lot sizes do seem to have a binding effect. So we would expect lot sizes generally to have something like a normal distribution, peak around whatever the prevailing market preference is, and then be evenly spread around there. But what we observe in even pro-growth land abundant context is that lot sizes cluster right at the minimum, which indicates that when you go above maybe 5,000 square feet, which incidentally is what Desegregate Connecticut has proposed for the statewide standard, minimum lot sizes seem to be binding. So they seem to be forcing lot sizes to be larger than they might otherwise have been. And we're talking about North Carolina and Texas contexts, which are generally, like I said, pro-growth and land abundant. In contexts like New England or the Mid-Atlantic, these can be a much bigger problem. So why care about large lots? If people were going out and platting large lots on their own volition, it's not necessarily an issue. But when local governments are forcing lots to be larger, this raises a few issues. Number one, it increases housing prices. So if you take a development which might have been, let's say, 2,500 square foot homes, and you impose a 5,000 square foot minimum lot size, you get half the number of homes, and each of those lots is larger, doubling the land cost for each individual home. So you're going to get fewer homes, which is going to have broader effects on housing affordability. And then the homes that are built are going to be necessarily more expensive. Of course, if local governments can do this, they can also determine the type of person who is able to afford a home in a community. So, or if you take a 5,000 square foot lot size that might have been built and say we're going to require 10,000 square feet or 20,000 square feet, of course, local governments can then have the power to exclude certain types of people, and that's what we do see in New England and Mid-Atlantic contexts. And then the third is, of course, sprawl, right? So, a state like Connecticut has a lot of beautiful farmland, and what a minimum lot size essentially does is it says more of that land is going to be consumed by single-family residential because we're going to impose a high minimum lot size. And so it requires cities to actually sprawl out more to meet their housing demand to the extent that they're meeting it, which requires more infrastructure and consumes more natural areas and open spaces. The good news is that lot size reform is possible. So, I mainly look at the Texas context. And in Houston in 1998, the reforms came into effect in 1999. They actually lowered their citywide minimum lot size from 5,000 square feet to 1,400 square feet. And so what that allowed some of these old post-war 1950s, 1960s ranch style homes to actually be subdivided into multiple townhouses, in many cases with rear loading driveways. And so you've seen, in research that I've done with Adam Millsap, we estimate around 25,000 units were able to be created as a result of this. It's possible in Houston, it's possible elsewhere. And we're seeing this happen in the Mid-Atlantic. So of course, Desegregate Connecticut's pushing a fantastic bill. I've done research in the New York City context on the possibility of having a 1,200 square foot maximum minimum in cities and 5,000 square feet in suburbs. This essentially brings down lot sizes to a reasonable rate where they're not actually having a binding effect on lot sizes. They're not pricing people out. They're not exacerbating segregation, and they're not needlessly driving sprawl. I'm excited for the conversation. Thankful to be here, and looking forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Nolan. Really informative, and appreciate you sharing, particularly about the Texas context and the actual consequences of reform. For our last panelist today, we have Corinne Moody, who's joining us, who leads the Hartford Area Habitat for Humanity. Corinne, I'll hand it over to you. After she finishes her talk, I've got a few questions for the panelists, but would welcome any questions from the audience. So feel free to throw them in the chat. Those will go to me, and then happy to ask them of the panelists. So, but without further ado, I will hand it over to Corinne.
Okay. Let's see if it's working. Okay. So good afternoon. My name is Corinne Moody, CEO of Habitat for Humanity, serving Hartford and Talon County. We're in the midst of an expansion. Many of you know Habitat for Humanity, our focus is around affordable home ownership. And so we have recently had the privilege of being able to expand outside of urban areas and actually go into more suburban areas. And so our experience has been that in many towns within our covenant is that we find that there is a minimum lot line, a minimum a size for each lot of, either from 1 acre to 2 acres, and then some really crazy numbers. And so, when I first started this process and, exploring and going outside of Greater Hartford, I realized that, what's an acre and why an acre? And I have to mirror all of my co-panelists in that, it's all of the above. They actually hit every single area that I wanted to talk about, but it's really the question of why an acre and what is an acre and what does it look like? And, is it the best use of land? So for me, it was the idea of, if you was to visualize a football field, that's basically an acre. And I do agree with the fact that, it's not just, it's a combination of all of our social economic policies in the past 150 years that's triggering that issue of an acre. I think it goes back to our farming history. I think it really connects with our definition between land and class and economic class in particular. And I think it also goes back to the American perspective or theology on, our desire to have abundant space and to consume and occupy. So clearly, when you think about a football field, the question is how many reasonably sized homes can fit on an acre of land. And in this visual from Washington Growth, they say an average of 18 size homes can fit on an acre. In my opinion, and in our experiences, the reality of affordable housing is that it comes down to two simple things. And the way that we'll be able to create more affordable housing, we need 1, existing structures to rehab, and 2 is the land. And so the question becomes, how do we maximize our land usage so that we can create more affordability, sustainability, and really cooperation? And the critical piece is land. If we're going to address some of the social, education, economic disparities within our communities, then this conversation is a much needed conversation in Connecticut and broader in the New England region. We have to constantly refigure what the value of home means to residents in Connecticut, and how can we as a collective force pool together our resources to make these changes happen at the state level. I wanted to give an example of just the bare bones of why excessive minimum lot lines plays into the role of developers. And so I gave 3 different towns for the sake of being professional and courtesy. I did not list towns, but these are actual MLS listings or actual deals that were made in the past 2 years pertaining to land. And so clearly town A is a buildable lot, it's for sale, it's about 1.5 acres. And the advertising or the listing says you can only build 1 single home on this lot per regulation. So, initially just stepping out the door, your land is $50,000. That's not even including any engineering, anything else. It's just $50,000 to come out the gate. You're gonna have about an acre and a half, and you're gonna build 1 house on it. In town B, it's a buildable lot. It's for $125,000. It's 12 acres. Imagine 12 football fields. Does one family need 12 football fields to live on? And the advertisement says, build your dream home and hunt in your backyard. Crazy, right? But that's what it says. In town C, we were proposing to look at a buildable lot for sale for $100K. It's about an acre and a half, and we have the capacity to build 10 single-family detached units that will be zero energy ready. And basically, in this diagram, in this split out, you can see the number of families served, but even more so, you can see the land use being maximized to the efficiency level so that we can continue to address home ownership affordability, housing affordability. In my opinion, in our opinion at Habitat, and this is Habitat throughout, is we have to look at land with the same lens that we view the environment and sustainability. if we want to create an environment or a society or a global village that addresses equity and brings the playing field into an equal balance, we have to look at land usage the same way how we look at recycling. We have to realize that in the end, it's not it's not a limitless land availability. We have to figure out what makes the most sense in terms of our usage of land, and we have to acknowledge that it is limited. And then my closing is that when you look at how many people are on our planet, it's 7.9 billion. I can just round that over to 8 billion people. And we have more than 1 billion living in poverty, slums, and other inhuman structures. And so we have to get this into balance. It has to become equitable. If 10, 20 years down the road, we want our children and the next generations to be able to live in an equitable society, then these are some of the areas that we have to look at land usage within this lens. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that presentation. And it's so valuable to have somebody who's actually doing this work of providing homes affordably in Connecticut. And I also appreciate the visual of the football field. I think it makes that a lot more concrete. Someone did point out to me in the chat that I had gotten my conversion wrong earlier in the program when I equated 0.92 acres with 20,000 square feet. 0.92 acres is actually 40,000 square feet. So an even starker sign of how much land we were requiring in our minimum lot sizes throughout the state. All right, as I mentioned, I've got a couple of questions for the panelists, but if you have any questions that you're eager to know more about, or whether it be for all three panelists or for anyone in particular, feel free to throw them in the chat. But to start off with, all three of your presentations actually touched on this, but would be curious to hear more direct answer to this, which is one objection we've gotten to minimum lot size reform from some parts is that it's really something that should be thought of for cities and for urban areas, but that there's less of a need in suburban areas. Starting off with, I guess we can go in the same order that our panelists originally went. Could you talk about a little bit why you think minimum lot size reform and reducing them should, or if you believe it, or should not apply in the suburban context?
Yeah, I guess that puts me first. Yeah, so I think, and I touched upon this as well, that often the potential for relaxing minimum lot sizes is kind of the greatest in suburban areas. And so I think especially if we're thinking about sort of households commuting as often as the case from suburbs into a central city, or again, I showed the case of the Boston area, but this is true in other areas as well, then creating smaller lots and potentially more affordable lots in those suburban areas, I think can be really useful. And those are areas where lots are the largest, so you can subdivide them in sort of the most ways. Whereas in already quite dense urban areas, one thing that can happen is if you relax zoning regulations in inner cities, you will be able to add housing supply, but you're also very likely to get a lot of people new households to move in quite fast, which then actually means that if you're trying to create affordable housing, you're a little bit limited in that, just because demand for those areas is extremely high. So I think actually thinking about land use regulations in the suburban context is extremely important also if we want people to be able to access cities which are getting increasingly more and more expensive. So that's sort of what I would say. But happy to hand it over to Nolan.
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is that's where the lot sizes are binding. So just to refer back to some of that work that I did with Salim in Texas, we didn't find a lot of evidence of a bind in suburbs that had around a 5,000 square foot minimum lot size. So we looked at Pearland, which was a Houston suburb. They had a minimum lot size around 5,000, and you wouldn't even be able to tell the minimum lot size based on distribution with a line, unless you had a line at 5,000. But when you creep up to around 7,500, 9,000, 10,000, And then of course, in the Connecticut context, you're going to start getting lot sizes like a half acre, 2 acres. There's pretty strong evidence of a bind. So in cities, the lot sizes for historical reasons are already relatively small. Of course, as I argue in the Houston context, there are benefits to lowering minimum lot sizes below 5,000 square feet in urban context where homes can be subdivided and maybe turned into 2 or 3 townhouses. And that's really what affordable housing looks like in 2021. But in suburbs, there's a huge opportunity because that's where the binding lot sizes are, minimum lot sizes are in many cases. And then of course, as Amrita mentioned, that's where you have actually a lot of large lots still that could actually potentially be subdivided. So if you have a lot of, for example, greenfield sites that are ready for sewer and water hookups, and you have a 10,000 or a 20,000 square foot minimum lot size, lowering the minimum lot size in that context could immediately start doing some good by allowing more houses to be on some of this greenfield development that's going to happen.
Yeah, so I agree 100% that it should be applied both in the urban and suburban setting. Our reality for me is that there is so much land and availability in our suburban towns, and that if we want to create affordable housing, this is the direction in which we need to go. If you look at where affordable housing is usually placed, it's always in urban areas. It's never in the suburban areas. And so, when you think about education, you think about fresh food, you think about food deserts, you think about all of the services that are, in the decline within our urban areas. The opportunity to balance that spreadsheet and provide housing outside of cities, I think is critical. I agree 100% with the platform that Desegregate Connecticut is taking, because, especially when you go out into the suburban areas and you have limited sewer connections, or you have to work with all of the infrastructure involved in terms of bringing housing. There is so much just, what did you call it? Just splurging of property and land everywhere. So we really want to get to the point that we maximize our land usage and still have some open fields and still have some grazing grass, but you want to get to the point that you maximize.
Absolutely appreciate all 3 of your perspectives on that. We've got a few questions in the chat, so I'm going to start with one that actually has come up in some of our research for our zoning atlas, which is about whether or not minimum lot size standards apply the same to single family homes and for multifamily housing, whether or not it applies the same across that. I don't know if in any of your research that's come up, but happy to throw it open to any of the panelists who want to take that one.
Yeah, I can handle this. So you do see this occasionally. I've seen this in a few contexts where you will have a 5,000 square foot minimum lot size for single family homes and a 10,000 square foot minimum lot size for duplexes. That effectively just means that you're not going to get any duplexes. And also there's not a clear health and safety justification for these types of distinctions. I mean, to a lesser extent, you see things like 5,000 square foot minimum lot size for single family homes or 7,500 square feet minimum lot size for duplexes. I as a planner, I look at this and I don't see a clear health and safety justification, but I do see standards that make it harder to build infill housing. And so, that's something that in terms of local governments reforming their own codes, which is, always the ideal here. Local governments really should go through and get rid of some of that discrimination against these infill housing typologies, which often do have larger minimum lot sizes that make them just totally unfeasible.
In our practice, we've primarily seen the preference for single family. There's so many hoops to go through to do multifamilies. It's just, it becomes not financially feasible.
I know Sarah Bronin, who led our zoning atlas project, has come across this issue. Sarah, I don't know if you wanted to add anything for what we found in Connecticut on this.
Oh, sure. Yeah, and I'll put a link in the chat to a paper that has a bunch of charts. Specifically, if you go to page 71, that's where the minimum lot size chart is. And we found that 98% of single family housing has a minimum lot size. which is a huge amount. And actually, to Nolan's point, 89% of 89% of land where two-family housing was allowed as of right also had a minimum lot size. And from Nick's comments earlier, you recall that in residential land, 81% of it has a 1 acre minimum. So you kind of add that together, 98% of one single family housing is and 81% of that has 1 acre minimums. It's a big deal, but you do see those minimums for all kinds of housing. Interestingly, to a lesser extent, for 4-family housing, largely because 4 or more family housing is subject to public hearings. And so when you go through that public hearing process, all kinds of other things are imposed on those kinds of applications through a much more, I would say, a much less regulated process. And so the minimum lot size is not as important because sometimes zoning commissions find other ways to thwart those projects.
We've got a couple of questions in the chat for Corinne in particular, which I'm going to try and combine into one here. In particular, some interest around how Habitat thinks about connecting with people and changing hearts and minds on this issue, whether it be minimum lot sizes in particular or allowing for more homes broadly. From your experience, has there been anything that has helped to whether it be to persuade people or to activate people who might be potential supporters to support the types of inclusive policies, even in some suburban areas that might embrace those policies at present that you found?
Definitely. I would say our strongest tool in the toolbox is communicating and working with our town officials. And I would say directly dealing with residents. So what we try to do in most cases when we're going into a new area is that we actually attend several resident meetings, public relations, community meetings, and we begin to get a consensus of what the community wants for that town. We build a coalition of supporters that will advocate for affordable housing within a new area. In one town in particular, although we thought it would be, we assumed that we would have some issues, and surprisingly enough, we were well received and were able to purchase land without any issues and going through the zoning requirements. And the town actually worked really well to make sure that we came into the area. On the flip side, we've gone to other areas where we assumed that we would be received and we were not. And we've had to actually, advocate strongly, ask volunteers to speak on our behalf, bring in letters of support from all over the town just to make sure that we can actually present ourselves to go into the process of actually submitting application. And so you never know where you will have a conflict or where you will have to confront stereotypes, myths, concerns of property values decreasing. You never know until you actually go, boots on the ground and actually go and speak to folks to find out where they are as a community.
Very informative. That's certainly been our experience as well. And a follow-up question from another person in the audience for you as well, before I throw it back over to Amrita Nolan, which was, for Habitat, is there a lot size or a per unit land cost that's a deal breaker for you in general, or is it more on a case-by-case basis?
It's more on a case-by-case basis. We're constantly looking at ways that we can build and scale. In my diagram, I shared a particular project that we're hoping to break ground in 2023. And in that regard, it was, okay, how can we increase and serve more families? And so however way we can get affordable home ownership, affordable housing into a new area outside of an urban area, we're willing to explore those details.
That's very helpful. Through this, I'll let Nolan or Amrita take this one. We had a question about a reform that was recently passed in Minneapolis, for example, and this has been something we've been thinking about in terms of balancing minimum lot size reform versus density reform, is if you could comment on whether or not 5,000 square foot minimum lot sizes that allows triplexes versus a situation that would allow 1,700 square foot minimum lot size for single family homes. Essentially, the math adds to the same dwelling units per acre, but one would get there via smaller lots of single family homes, one would get there with slightly larger lots with more units per acre. If you have thoughts on the trade-offs between those two policies.
This is not directly to the point, but one thing that is, I think, extremely important in the Minneapolis context is that what happened there is, for the most part, allowing something that's a non-single family home to be built. And that has actually led to very, very few permit applications in the last couple of years since this policy was introduced. And something that I find in research with my co-authors in the greater Boston area is that actually allowing the type of housing, so the allowing multifamily homes, triplexes, duplexes, without changing density is not necessarily going to lead to a lot more housing supply, because that's essentially just saying that we're going to change what type of housing we're allowing without changing how much. So I think something that we find is that this density regulation is extremely important. So definitely taking care, even if you're changing sort of whichever way you're getting there, you have to make sure that you actually allow more density if you want sort of actually more supply to be permitted or to appear. So that's, I think, something that I would say to this, but I'll allow Nolan or Crane to take over from here.
Before Nolan jumps in, I might just add an additional question somewhat related to the chat to kind of throw this into the mix, which was how minimum lot size reform works in the context of existing built lots, where you might have an existing home, how reform actually plays out. I don't know if you've seen that in particular in your research in Texas or elsewhere.
Yeah, well, just to address that first question, Amrita's exactly right. What you're seeing a lot of cities do is they will eliminate single family zoning, but they won't actually increase the buildable density, or they won't actually change their massing standards. So you'll still have the buildable envelope, essentially the 3D space that a building can inhabit. You'll have the building envelope of a 1950s ranch home, and then you might change the zoning to say, well, theoretically, this can now be a triplex, but there's not actually enough buildable floor area there. And so very few of these units get built. I think it's very important that we not only, reevaluate the use rules, which it's very important, stuff like single family zoning has a really troubled history and is a major factor in exacerbating housing scarcity. But if you don't also change the density or massing rules to actually allow those homes to be turned into low-rise, missing middle multifamily, you're not going to get a lot of additional housing. I would say, I think, you mentioned the alternative of focusing on subdividing homes. I think you said 1,700 square feet. At 1,700 square feet, that allows you to essentially subdivide a standard 5,000 square foot lot in half. So that lets you get two homes, and they can be fee simple, meaning both lots are independent. You have owner occupancy opportunity, you have ownership opportunities for both homes. I would probably, if that's the route you're going to go, I would probably suggest a slightly lower minimum lot size, at least below around 1,600, because below 1,600 you can then take a standard 5,000 square foot lot and have 3 townhomes on it. That's the model that Houston followed. They have a minimum lot size as low as 1,400 square feet, and that allowed basically a lot of these old, to your second question, a lot of these old 1950s, 1960s single family homes, which were realistically finishing out their original built lifespan, right? So they were going to require significant improvements. They were going to require significant investment. They were floor plans that didn't reflect modern, smaller family sizes of, maybe a single parent or, 2 adults with 1 child. These were larger homes that didn't necessarily meet those needs and were much more expensive. Houston, by lowering the minimum lot size to allow those homes to be subdivided, created a lot more ownership opportunities within the built area of Houston, in many cases near major job centers and transit. So, I'm all of the above. I think it's good to allow low-rise multifamily opportunities, to allow households for whom, they don't want to buy a home, or maybe they're not ready to buy a home, downsizing seniors who are living on a fixed income, or young adults who maybe don't have the cash on hand to make a down payment. But I think you should also be creating these home ownership opportunities, and you do that by allowing for these home subdivisions, allow these big homes that were built in many cases over a half century ago to be turned into homes that better suit modern needs.
Thanks for that perspective, and that's certainly very helpful. We have time for one last question, so I'm going to throw this open to each of our panelists to take a swing at. And this somewhat builds off of what Corinne was talking about earlier in terms of generating public support and connecting with potential supporters. But we had a question about how to engage with skeptics who might raise objections, particularly about stressing existing infrastructure like the power grid or aging water and sewer systems, increased demand on schools and community services. We frequently see these objections come up in our work to a lot of our proposed reforms, and particularly around minimum lot size reform. What do you think is the strongest response to those potential objections? So why don't we can do the same order as our panelists. We can go Amrita, Nolan, and then end with Corinne.
So I actually really like this idea that Desegregate Connecticut already has, which is thinking about sort of adding density first in particular areas, or thinking about building a lot of density near transit stations where it's quite, it makes a lot of sense to add density so people can commute. It's an efficient way, and it's sort of limited a little bit in a local way. So I think that's actually sort of getting often, I think, homeowners, but in general, just residents used to the idea of having somewhat gentle density in their neighborhood, or these, I think Nolan called it, low-rise multifamily homes, for example, in their neighborhood. I think that's sort of one way to go forward, is to sort of begin by saying that we're going to limit it to this area, and we're going to add density here where we can have these strong environmental improvements as well as efficiency gains for commuters, and sort of start taking it from there. That's what I'd say.
I spend a lot of time talking to state legislators all over the country, and the number one line that I found that really sticks is, where are your children going to live? All over the country in high cost contexts, if I'm a homeowner, right, things are going kind of well for me. My number one investment is increasing in value. I like my community. I don't necessarily want it to change. But then what happens when, you want your children to live within an hour of where you live, and the cheapest home is at least $500,000 or worse in some of these contexts. You're seeing this, of course, here in the California context. You see it in the Northeastern context. People are realizing, there is no path to home ownership for my children. They're going to have to move away. They're going to have to move to a place like Florida or Arizona or Texas. And, over time, that just destroys communities. People have this idea of, if we stop new housing production, we'll stop change, and my community is going to stay the way it was, when I bought my home 30 years ago. That's not the case. The community is going to change one way or another. It can change by adding new housing that keeps people around and keeps communities strong and keeps families together. Or it can change in the sense of not physically changing, but becoming more expensive, more exclusionary, more exclusive over time. And so, when I'm talking to people and they're saying, I'm not feeling any housing pressure, but my son and his wife are having to move 3 hours away because there's no affordable housing near me. Then I think people start to get it. And, we need to make sure that historically we've had a lot of housing abundance, we've had a lot of housing opportunity. And I think that it's incumbent on people who are comfortable and housed, and they've seen, their homes increase in value. I think they have a responsibility to make sure that the next generation has those opportunities too. And I think more and more people are starting to get it. So I'm very optimistic about it. And thanks in no small part to the advocacy of Desegregate Connecticut.
Definitely agree. I find that we have to have our facts together. So when we went to one particular town that we had some, disagreement on whether or not Habitat should build, we came prepared with the facts of where the town was currently, and that the 4 units that we were building was not going to negatively impact that particular town. The other piece that I say, and this is what kept me sane, is that we know that we are creating a societal good, and to not get scared and not get deterred by someone else's, in many cases, self-focused, uninformed stance. So you have to be strong within yourself and say, I'm not going to be scared. I'm going to go and fight the good fight and push forward. So definitely.
Well, that is a great note to end on. I'm just briefly going to share a couple of additional things from us, which is a reminder that we have lots of resources on this issue on our website, desegregatect.org/lots, where you can find a lot of the information that was shared today and some other resources on minimum lot sizes, as well as on our website, on our Be the Change page, some playbooks for how you can be an advocate and build on some of the lessons that were just shared to advocate for change in your community, whether you're an advocate, a land use commissioner, or a candidate for local office in your town. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us, not just for this event, but for the entirety of our fall event series. I have learned a lot, and I think anyone who's attended has learned a tremendous amount for our fantastic panelists from throughout the fall who've taught us so much about the opportunities we have with zoning reform and teed up what we hope will be a very productive legislative session in Connecticut this coming February to take on some of these issues. So I want to thank our panelists and wish everyone a happy holidays.
Thank you.